Sound test test. Sound good? Okay, good deal. Cat out of the way. Well, it is 8 o'clock, and I'm gonna assume that means I ought to get going. So, shall I just jump in and begin? Because we do have an hour to discuss assessment, identity building assessment. So I shall proceed. And of course, this is the time that my cat decides to show up and uh, provide us company. But thank you guys for showing up today. I'm going to talk about identity building assessment from a number to a showcase of knowledge. Uh, I am currently a PhD student at University of Wyoming for math education, and I write often about math and assessment and other things at my website at immersionmath.com. I'm the author of Necessary Conditions, Teaching Secondary Math with Academic Safety, Quality Tasks, and Effective Facilitation. And in there, you'll find some of the things I'm going to talk about, but even since this was published in a couple years ago, I've done some research and worked with some teachers on developing student portfolios and alternative assessments, assessments that really generate positive outcomes for students. Um, so there's some stuff in there, but this will be almost like an extension of that. If you're into the Twittering, my Twitter handle is just Jeff Crawl, and my email is gmcrawl@gmail.com. If you'd like to touch base and talk more about assessment, math, or anything under the sun. So let's start with the why. Why do we want to promote alternative forms of assessment, such as performance portfolio assessment? Well, I'm going to start with a story from when I was visiting a school in Southern California in 2016, I think it was, so a little while back. Um, there, I was observing a math class, and the math class broke for lunch, and the teacher had to leave the room. But I was really interested in some of the stuff I was seeing on the wall, some of the student work, and so I asked the teacher if she could explain, what kind of things, what kind of reflections were on the wall. And she asked one of her students to go ahead and show me because she had to scramble out for lunch. And behind the teacher's desk was this large like filing cabinet from like a World War II surplus store or something like that. That's not the actual filing cabinet on the left. That's just like a stock photo or something I found. But that's the kind of filing cabinet. I mean, you know the kind that like when you open it, it's like somehow like longer, like the individual drawers are longer than the cabinet is deep. Those like, you know, fireproof filing cabinets. Anyway, so this student sort of pulls out her portfolio and she opens it up and she's kind of explaining what they do. And they take sort of a problem of the week approach where they take a problem every Friday or something, they do a complex math task, and then they add it to their portfolio and they do some reflective writing on it as well. And the student was sort of looking at this and looking at her first problem, and then another problem from a couple weeks later, and another problem from a couple weeks later. She was just looking at sort of the progression, just like all in front of her all at once while explaining it to me. And she sort of stopped and she sort of trails off, and then uh, she just looks at it and she's looking at her work and she just says, "Damn, I have grown." Um, and to me, that was truly the moment that I fell in love with the idea of student portfolios, because most of the time in math, we just assess on an ever growing number of things. And that's fine. I mean, math does kind of build on itself in a lot of ways. But what that communicates to students is this. So this is a graph I made a little while ago that sort of demonstrates the idea that over time, we assess kids typically on traditional tests where students are asked to demonstrate knowledge of certain things. And then we add a little bit more. We add unit 2, unit 3. So we're assessing kids on an ever growing list of things on which we are to assess them. I don't know if that makes sense. And again, that's sort of natural because mathematics often builds on each other. That's why we have standards and course progressions and things like that. But what that looks like to a student is this. So that orange line can kind of represent the sort of assessment tool, the test or something like that. And so even though this kid in this example, they're learning more and more stuff and they're growing as a mathematician, everything below that orange line, that's a fail. That's considered a failure because it's not up to that orange line. So we have a student that's growing here, but 3 out of the 7 tests they take, they receive a failing score or a non-proficient score. And that's the message that kids really take away, is that even if we see their growth, they might not, because of the sort of standard traditional way in which they receive feedback. So portfolios can be kind of an antidote to that. So it takes away the sort of it sort of lets us see on a progression how students are doing over time. And just adding to the mix a little bit, we've seen, interestingly, over the past year really, and continuing into this year, a sort of de-emphasis on the SAT and ACT. So for example, I think the University of California, or the California university system, is no longer considering the ACT and SAT in their admissions process. Most other universities are saying if you want to include it, you can, but honestly, we're just looking at other forms of evidence. And sometimes that evidence can be clunky because students, up until now, and teachers certainly aren't prepared with this idea of delivering qualitative evidence to universities for admissions. We're used to preparing students for SATs and ACTs. So as math teachers, how do we possibly provide evidence that students should be admitted to a university without those, sacrosanct scores? And one way that we can do that is to provide students with the opportunity to develop and craft student portfolios. And then I guess one last reason why that I've sort of fallen in love with the idea of student portfolios is this quote from a book called Changing the Way You Teach, Improving the Way Students Learn. And the quote is this: assessment is at its best when it's ongoing and indistinguishable from teaching. So what that means to me is that if a student enters a classroom, there may be no difference. They may not perceive any difference between a day that they are learning things and a day that they are being assessed on things. Currently, in most classrooms, for when we have a traditional test structure, it's almost ironic because we want to teach kids in a certain way. We want to have them using groups. We want them using discussions. We want them doing complex tasks. And then as soon as it's assessment time, we shut everything down. Students are working on items individually. They're typically low level, multiple choice. So it's like we're teaching kids and saying this is good instruction one way with dynamic interactions. And then as soon as it's time to test, we change everything. We change the whole ball game, and we have tests in a manner that's entirely different than how we were teaching. So this quote really resonates with me and what I sort of aspire to do in my classrooms. So let's talk more about the how. So we've talked about some of the why around portfolios. Let's talk about the how. So what we're looking for are assessments that achieve these 3 things. Assessments that cause no harm to students' math identity. We know that traditional tests often can harm a student's math identity. We actually saw the example a moment ago where a student was actually growing and getting better as a mathematician, but the message he or she was receiving was that they were sort of like borderline. Some of their tests were failures, some of them were successes. So we want a method of assessment that causes no harm to that. We want a form of assessment that mirrors typical classroom action. So again, equalizing our teaching practice and our assessment practices. And then last thing, and this is where it's going to get a little tricky, is that we want assessment methods that are reliable and valid. We want an assessment tool that lets us know what students are able to do in mathematics in a concrete way, because that'll also help us make instructional choices afterwards. If we see students are struggling in a certain area, we as a teacher can modify or provide remediation or enrichment activities to help students achieve more highly. So again, that leads me to this idea of performance or portfolio assessment, where, just to define it briefly, but we'll get more into the weeds as this hour continues, we sort of we want a sort of thing that students can look at over time that showcases their growth as a mathematician. That's maybe the most broadest definition of a portfolio system of assessment I can offer. And within there, there's going to be a lot of instructional choices that you'll have to make, or your school will have to make. And again, we'll get into some of the weeds in a moment. So key ingredients to a portfolio system. Again, this is going to seem very broad at first, because it could mean a lot of different things based on your particular classroom, based on your content area. But here are the key ingredients that I've experienced as a teacher and as an instructional coach and as a researcher that go into a portfolio system. The first ingredient is to incorporate high quality or complex tasks. So the sort of bedrock of a portfolio system is that you need math tasks that are robust enough to showcase both student ingenuity and possible errors or misconceptions, because we want to sort of shine a light on both of those things. And you can't do that with the multiple choice test. There's not enough, for the lack of a better term, there's not enough stuff there. Like if a student ticks off A, B, C, or D, that's not going to give us much information and much insight into their thinking. So we need complex tasks that are of high quality, that potentially connect with a lot of different mathematical concepts. The second thing we need is a place to store the student artifacts. And this could be physically, such as the filing cabinet I referenced a moment ago, or they could be digitally. Some of the examples we'll see today incorporate digital portfolios. And to be sure, with the school system we had last year, and may or may not have this year, teachers are really quick to adopt technology tools that will allow us to store student work digitally and student artifacts digitally. So that could be a Google Drive. A lot of schools use Google Suites and integrate that, or even Google Classroom. Or it could even be just a big old filing cabinet, like I said. It could be anything. The third ingredient to a portfolio system are metacognitive prompts and a way to encourage the metacognition process. So as I said in the example before with the school in Southern California, after every task, they would incorporate some sort of writing. So prompts can be something like, what was challenging about this task? What habits of mathematicians did you experience and showcase throughout the task? Some sort of writing process at the end. And then even beyond that, when you zoom out and you have 3, 4, 5 tasks that students are able to sort of zoom out and take a look at, you can include another metacognitive writing prompt in which you ask students, how have you grown over these past 4 or 5 mathematical tasks. So you need some sort of bank of those. In addition to a bank of tasks, you need a bank of writing prompts or some sort of reflection prompts. And it doesn't have to mean writing necessarily. You could have discussions. That said, a writing is potentially a way to, again, have yet another sample of evidence for students and their growth. And then the last thing, I guess, isn't entirely necessary because I have seen teachers do this in isolation. However, when I do work with schools, I recommend that they craft a professional development plan centered around these portfolios and centered around tasks and student work. When teachers do this in isolation, it's good and it's great, and we see positive outcomes. But when a team or even an entire school center their professional learning around student work, then you really see the benefits of a portfolio system. Because not only are you assessing tasks and kids are seeing the growth, but your colleagues are also giving you input and insight into the student work that they see. So they might see something in a student's work that will illuminate potential future lessons for you that you may not see. You're just sort of you designed the task, you saw kids working on it, so you might be sort of I don't know, you may not see what another teacher might see. Excuse me. So some sort of professional development plan with the department, grade level team, or an entire school can be beneficial. I've even seen many schools use portfolios as a sort of culminating process or culminating event. So at the end of a semester, they actually have a presentation from students, and students are asked to stand and present their learning over the course of a semester vis-a-vis their portfolio system. It's almost like if to give you a mental model, it's almost like when a student at the university level has to defend a master's thesis or even a dissertation or something like that. It sort of harkens to that. So a student stands in front of a panel of their teachers, maybe their peers, maybe their parents, maybe community members, and they describe their learning over the course of the semester or even in the course of a school year. So in these cases, a portfolio is really truly in the DNA of the school. And one of the things that can do is embed the portfolio system in a way that it's just hard to do with individuals. I've also seen instances where individuals get really geared up for a portfolio system. They implement it for a year, but then it sort of fades off after 2 years. Maybe it's year 2 it's not as robust as year 1. And then by year 3, they're kind of either burnt out on it, or other things get in the way, or the grading system that their school uses doesn't really mesh well. So it just makes it more harder to sustain if you're doing this individually. It could be done, and I've certainly seen individual teachers utilizing portfolios for years and years and years with fidelity. It's just easier when it's more entrenched in the school system. That is a larger conversation. It's hard to have with just a single teacher. That's more of like an administrative team conversation. But I do want to throw that out there, that the more it's integrated into the DNA of the school, the more likely it is to be sustainable. Okay, so going forward, I'd like to share profiles and portfolios. So over the past year, I had the opportunity to talk to and interview and survey several different teachers, but I'm going to showcase 3 of them. The first of which is Alex, and each of them, what I find interesting, and the reason I selected these 3 folks, is that they're all very unique. Their portfolio system is unique, and last year, as you know, was a very tumultuous year, and there was a lot of difference in how students experienced school. And that definitely played into some of the differentness of these portfolios. But I think even in a regular school year, we'll be able to see some of the differences. And I'll just say that I don't think there's one correct approach other than those like key ingredients we saw earlier. So hopefully by looking at these three different systems, you'll be inspired to maybe pull from different pieces from them. So I'm going to start with Alex. Alex is on Twitter as well. You can see his Twitter handle there. His school was binned last year into hybrid quadmesters, and basically what that meant is that they had the students partitioned into different um, uh, cohorts, and that they would meet every other day for a half of a semester. And then Alex had to bundle his entire course into that experience. What that meant in practice was that he would see students for just over 10 times, less than 15 times over the entire course. So there was an element of remote learning, but for the most part, most of the learning that occurred within the classroom was only for, honestly, a handful of days. And his motivation to use portfolios was that he did not want to spend a single second um, on testing. If he has very precious time with students, he doesn't want them using any time to spend on individual tests and being silent at their desks and whatnot. So that was his sort of motivation. He was also inspired by Peter Liljedahl's Thinking Classroom, Building Thinking Classrooms, which is an excellent book. And there's a lot of examples in there of how to um, develop, design, and facilitate tasks that get kids thinking and working and excited about math. So between these two combinations, he decided to implement portfolios last year in which students would um, work on tasks throughout the week and provide evidence to Alex about what they had learned. So because he centered his entire classroom around tasks based on building thinking classrooms, what he would do is ask students to think back on the tasks they've experienced over the course of the week. And he would ask them, here's the standard, or here's the learning target for the week. Here are the tasks we did. Which task that you performed do you feel really well embodies this learning target for the week? And so students would go back and review their work, engage in that metacognitive process, and have to justify why this particular work demonstrated understanding of this topic. So students were actually the ones that went back and selected the items that demonstrated the learning. So again, he was working through this metacognitive process where students would look back and reflect and provide evidence. Another cool thing that Alex did was get feedback from the students, because this was the first time he had really concretely done portfolios in his class. Out of necessity, out of a desire to try something different, this was the first year he really went whole hog into the use of student portfolios. And so he asked students, he had them fill out a survey at the end of the quadmester. What was this experience like for you? And here are a few select pieces of feedback from students. One piece of feedback, the very top one, said that the student could show their understanding of many topics without the stress of having to complete a confusing problem on the spot. Once again, student 2 also reports that he or she experienced a lot less stress from this course. And then I thought this last one was really interesting, because I think this is something I notice and experience from students. He or she says, at the beginning, when doing my first portfolio, I found it difficult to explain my thought process in words, rather than just answering a question on a test. But as the course progressed, my feelings changed. And that's something I've experienced many times as a teacher and as an instructional support coach and as a researcher, is that the first one can often be challenging. I mean, that's kind of the whole point. If we're trying to showcase how students grow over time, then kind of by definition, the first experience is going to be kind of meh. So um, if you're employing a portfolio system, just be ready for that. If this is the first time students are asked to write and engage in a metacognitive process, then it's going to be kind of clunky. And we we almost want it to be kind of clunky because we want to be able to showcase to students over time that they're going to improve. They're going to improve in their writing. They're going to improve in their mathematics skills. Our next profile in portfolios, we're going to look at a different system here. And the next profile is Jen. Jen is a teacher. You can see her Twitter there, Jen S. White. And she is a teacher in North Carolina. And she actually teaches at a residential school, meaning students actually live on campus. It's a school for the arts, so it's a little bit different. But she was actually remote for the entire year. So even though it was a residential campus, because of because of health and safety protocols, she was teaching remotely to students. And she too wanted to provide more positive assessment experience for students. And her motivation were these two things. She was kind of inspired about this notion of anchor problems. So the idea there is, and this is something that can be found in my book, Necessary Conditions, this idea that if students are able to demonstrate mastery of particular standards, it can be done so through this use of anchor problems. So the idea is, here are 10 problems that showcase my learning over the course of the year, and that showcase my ability to do math at a high level based on all these standards. So if you have, I don't know, 10 units of instruction, like what is a problem that would really demonstrate a high level of understanding of each of those 10 units? And that's naturally going to be a complex task. It's going to connect across several mathematical concepts. So she was really inspired by that. And then also, I thought this was really interesting when I was talking to her. She pondered, like, what would tell the story about what a student knows about math. So rather than the story being, they got a 78, then an 85, then a 72, she wanted a portfolio that sort of told a story about how students progressed over time. So almost like a narrative. So her system looked different than Alex's. What she did, and I thought was really interesting, she gave students all the portfolio problems at the beginning of the year and had students attempt or just like hypothesize on how they might solve it. So all the portfolio problems, even stuff that she hadn't covered yet. The first couple of weeks of school, or maybe it was just the first week, she gave students every single task that was required for the portfolio. So things that students probably didn't know how to do yet. Stuff that she was going to eventually teach them, but she went ahead and gave it to them at the beginning of the year, and said, give it a shot, try it, see if you can do it. Or even if you can't, I don't expect you to be able to do it or do all of them. See how far you can get, or even just hypothesize what are some of the things that you might need to learn in order to complete this task. Then after that experience, she proceeded with her sort of normal scope and sequence over the course of the year. And at the sort of appropriate time, she would encourage students to revisit particular tasks. So she would say, we've completed this unit on, transversals or something like that. If you'll recall from task 2, There were some parallel lines and a transversal going through it. Now you might be able to, uh, give that another shot and either revise your work or improve your work or expand on it or maybe start from scratch and solve it all over again. And so just like by nature, she's engaging in that metacognitive progress and students or process, and students are seeing their progress because they know, they know very concretely in August I could not solve this task, but in October it can. Like that, I mean, that's about as concrete in terms of growth of mathematical know-how that I can think of. And again, she incorporated reflection prompts. What made this challenging before? What made you able to solve it now? What are the things you experienced in between that helped you get from essentially point A to point B? Or point A, we couldn't solve it, and point B, we can. And even for the students that were able to, do a pretty decent job on it, she would have students, expand their solution or maybe tighten up the vocabulary or revise it to be more concise or more clear. So she can even ask students to work on some communication skills. Uh, so, uh, so just by nature of giving students the problems at the beginning of the year, she was having students engage in that metacognitive process. Really interesting portfolio system. Um, so I thought that was really cool. And again, she would have students give reflections, and she would annotate their reflections or their writing. And I thought this was great. She offered me the opportunity to review some of um, her students' reflections. Her writing is in the red. You can see some of the feedback that she offers there. But I highlighted in red one section right in the middle there that just delighted me to no end, where it says, "Dude, dot 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 dot, math is fun." And then the student goes on to explain how initially they dreaded the task, and they use the term marinate. You see that word marinating there right in the middle of your screen. They talked about marinating on their thinking. So experience something, then just sort of sit with it for a while, marinate, learn a few more things, and then come back to it. So this is sort of a vocabulary that their class took up. But again, you see how students experienced the growth process through the tasks and through these reflections. So I thought this was wonderful. So kudos to Jen. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about Ella. I'm going to talk a little bit more briefly about Ella. You can see her Twitter handle there, Mrs. Harith. Because the reason I wanted to showcase her portfolio system is because her school is an example of a system where portfolios are just something that they do. Ella teaches at a grade 7 and 8, so junior high, middle school here in the U.S. School, and every student at the beginning of their 7th grade year gets a portfolio and that they add to over the course of grades 7 and 8, and then they graduate into the upper level school after that. And their school is portfolios are just something that they do. I don't recall when they started doing it, but they have embedded it into their DNA, as I mentioned. And so what that means is that every teacher in every course offers portfolios. They sort of have to. That's sort of a mandate from, I don't want to say it's a mandate from above. It's just a sort of a shared understanding that this is how we'll engage students in a metacognitive process. Now, the reason I wanted to showcase Ella a little bit is because while her system was really great as a math teacher, which I'll showcase a little bit in a second. Some of her colleagues, it just wasn't as robust as it could have been. Basically, what some of her colleagues did was take their traditional tests, 20-question tests, multiple choice, and just like staple them together and put them in the student portfolio. And that was their portfolio. So their portfolios ended up being just a collection of tests. And such teachers never really like went through them and didn't engage in a metacognitive process. It was just a very performative portfolio experience. Basically, just checking the box, just get it out of the way. We have to do this, so we're going to just staple our tests together as we've always done and just put it in the portfolio. Ella's system was not like that, but that does represent a potential pitfall when you sort of give teachers a mandate to do something without the requisite professional development. So I want to share just one slide about Ella's portfolio system. Hers was interesting. She created a Google slide deck for her class for each individual task. So a Google slide deck, just like the one that you're watching this video on. And all students were able to edit it, and they had access to it, and they could navigate around and look at one another's work. And what she would have them do, spend time in class remotely, she would ask them to comment on one another's work. So her prompt was to have students look at, because it's a slide deck, you can sort of navigate up and down, and because they have editing access, they can actually add comments to particular pages. So she would prompt students to give feedback or ask questions to other students. So students would upload their work, they would put it there, and the work was sometimes a picture, sometimes it was done all digitally, however they wanted to showcase their work. And then other students would make comments on it. And so that actually had the added benefit of not only engaging students in this metacognitive process, but also building a positive class culture, because one student was offering praise to another student and adding comments and asking questions on another student. So it was building, even remotely, even digitally, it was building this environment around discussion and asking questions and encouragement. So this was a really interesting portfolio system in which it was very, I guess the word is public facing, or at least public within a certain class. It was very classroom forward, I guess, is one way to put it. And she actually used this as sort of a teaching tool and as sort of a group artifact that we could all look at. So, like I said, this had the added benefit of building positive class culture, discourse, and other great things that we want to see. So those are three very different examples of portfolio systems. And to be sure, your school is going to be different. You have a different school than Alex, than Jen, or from Ella. You have a different experience with portfolios than I do when I facilitated them in my class. So you're going to have some decision points to consider. So here are three considerations to maybe ponder. And spoiler alert, I'm not going to answer these necessarily for you, because there's a lot of learning that needs to be done here. And I don't think that there's a correct, right, or wrong way to tackle each of these. These are just things to consider before you jump in. The first things to consider and this is a decision point that I saw approached differently from all three of our profiles, is, are you going to assign specific problems, or are you going to ask for students post facto to find evidence? So for example, Jen provided specific problems, anchor problems at the beginning of the school year. Alex asked students to review the tasks they had completed and said, find the task that you think showcases this really well. So basically, who's in charge of the tasks? And I could certainly see benefits to both approaches, but that's one thing to potentially consider. The next decision point is what are your reflection prompts? So when you complete a task, or after you complete several tasks, what are you going to ask students to get them to engage in a metacognitive process, to get involved in reflection? As I said, I often asked, sort of my base level question was like, what was challenging about this task? And how did you display your talents as a mathematician throughout the task? And through this, I'm able to communicate that math isn't just about being able to compute things really quickly or add numbers in a, always correctly in a really efficient way. I was able to also communicate things like a part of being a mathematician is being able to communicate well, communicate concisely and with clarity. Part of being a mathematician isn't just to answer questions, but to ask questions as well. So through these reflections prompts, you can sort of advocate for the discipline of math itself. So consider that. And lastly, and this is maybe one of the stickiest and or thorniest points, is how will you assess tasks as a requirement for proficiency? So are you going to require proficiency in showcasing these tasks as a standard of to obtain credit for your course or to obtain credit for a particular grading period? I've seen this approached a couple different ways. Some have, some haven't. Some teachers, such as Alex, and really all the teachers that were profiled here, got rid of tests entirely and used this as their requirement for proficiency. Other teachers didn't feel as confident doing that, so they would have students do portfolios in tandem with their traditional tests, and the traditional tests were the sort of primary assessment thing for students' grades. I don't know if that would change as time goes along with some of our new skills around portfolios and some of our new problem banks, but that some teachers didn't feel totally comfortable abandoning tests entirely. So that's something to consider is will you or how will you assess these tasks? I, in my class, used a sort of scoring rubric. So for each task, I would design a rubric. And if I'll reshare my blog in a moment, but you can read all about rubrics there. But I would share a rubric to students, and I would score them. And I would say, if you disagree with my scoring, or if you'd like to improve your score, let's talk about it. Let's do it. Let's improve your score on this rubric. So I did use them as assessment materials and as a requirement that went into their grade at the end of the 6 weeks, because we had to give a grade. We didn't have a choice about that. So that's how I assessed it. Other teachers don't feel as comfortable using these as graded items. That's something you'll have to consider. And again, I would encourage, if you're doing this as a team, consider devoting consider developing considerable professional development time to that. All right, so sort of to recap, why student portfolios? We would like an assessment system that causes no, or at least minimizes harm to students' math identity over traditional tests. We want an assessment system that looks similar to our typical high quality instruction. Portfolios can do that in a way that isolated individual tests cannot. And lastly, we want assessment items that are reliable and valid. And that'll come with time, and that'll come with professional development. But these sort of motivators are what go into a portfolio system of assessment. You might also hear the term performance assessment. That's a pretty similar thing. Performance assessments are more like individual assessments rather than showing the spectrum over time. So it's almost like a portfolio is a collection of performance assessments, but that's getting a little semantic, and I don't want to spend too much time dithering about vocabulary. All right, so let's recap and talk about next steps. So just our ingredients for a portfolio system. First ingredient, high quality complex tasks. One place to potentially find high quality complex tasks is on my website at emergentmath.com. What I've done is I've taken basically grades 3 through 11 of the Common Core state standards. I know that's a US based system, so there'll have to be some modification there. But basically, I took grades 3 through 11 and identified what I consider pretty decent or high quality complex tasks for each cluster of standards. So if you'd like a task that addresses, I don't know, parent functions, something like that, you could navigate to emergentmath.com, find my problem-based curriculum maps, and search through the appropriate content. And there'll be links that point outward to other people's fine work. And I'll just, I'll fully admit that most of the tasks in there are not mine. They are tasks that I have found online from educators I respect and trust. And then the other thing is that there's not a paywall or anything like that. They're not behind a certain curriculum. They're freely available unless things have changed. But all the tasks on there, I try to keep up to date, are freely available, high quality, complex tasks. I tell teachers the really interesting thing about teaching math in the 21st century. There's sort of a good thing and bad thing. The good thing is that we've never had more high quality, complex math tasks than are currently available. And the bad thing is that we've never had more high quality, complex math tasks than are currently available. And that can be really overwhelming for a new teacher or even for a veteran teacher to not know, like, where do I start? One place to potentially start is to look at emergentmath.com, where you'll find a repository and a menu of tasks. So high quality complex tasks is ingredient number one. Ingredient number two, as I had mentioned, is simply a place to store them, physically or digitally. Google Drive works great. A big old filing cabinet works great. Those manila folders are always fun to open up. There is something nice about having like a physical thing to look at because you can like splay them out. And when I think of the student that I was discussing at the very outset of this, I mean, it was really cool to see her look at a task physically, and be able to like visually scan it from August to September to October to November, and to not have to click through, but rather like visually scan and see like the actual progression. So I like physical artifacts, but certainly Google Drive works just as well. Third ingredient, as I mentioned, metacognition. How are you going to encourage the metacognitive process or facilitate the metacognitive process? Writing prompts, discussion prompts, things to consider. And then, as I mentioned, a sort of fourth super ingredient, I would call it, is a professional development plan. I often work with schools to help them develop their portfolio system, and I also give them guidance on how to truly make that the focus of their professional learning for the school year. My recommendation is to typically sweep aside other initiatives, if at all possible, and focus solely on professional development because it does take a lot of work. You have to find the tasks. You have to design potentially rubrics around the tasks. You have to develop these reflection prompts and find time for that. You have to analyze the student work where, if it's a multiple choice test, it's really easy to analyze, A, B, C, or D. It's either right or it's wrong. Some of the student work that you'll collect is going to be a little bit more nuanced. The nice thing is that you might have one or two things to assess rather than, 20 questions. But to truly analyze student work on a deep level does take time. It does take training, and there's plenty of protocols to do that as a team. So my recommendation is always to have a professional development plan that honors teachers' times and honors the sort of heaviness and weightiness and complexity of this work. So that is all I have for you today. However, the topic of portfolios and assessment is really exciting and very broad. So I would encourage you to do some additional learning at my website. So again, emergentmath.com. I just completed a 6-part series on rubric design. So that sort of falls in line with some of these items we've discussed here. Also, if you just search for portfolios or assessment, you can see several of my blog posts that I've written about assessment with additional examples, additional things to consider, and some additional tools to take a look at. So I encourage you to go to emergentmath.com for continued learning. Also, if you'd like to follow me on Twitter, where I often talk about math, sometimes talk about more ridiculous things, you can do so at Jeff Kroll. And lastly, I'll share my email once again at gmcrawl@gmail.com. Or if you go to emergentmath.com, you can find the contact page and you can fill out a little thing and it'll shoot me an email. So if you'd like to talk about more about math or portfolio systems or assessment in general, please don't hesitate to reach out. And thank you so much for attending my session. And I hope that the profiles of Alex and of Jen and of Ella have inspired you to consider embedding some sort of portfolio aspect into your classroom and your school next year. Thank you much. And if you do have any questions, we have a few minutes for Q&A in the chat. I'd be happy to address specifics, or if you have additional questions. Oh my. So I'll stick around for a few minutes and see if there's any questions you guys have. And I'll also put in my website here if you're interested in additional stuff in the chat. All right. Well, if there are no questions, I will bid you guys a wonderful day and let you jump into your next session that you're headed to, and or get a coffee or a snack or whatever you desire. Thanks so much. Cheers.